Hi everyone, I'm Dan Worth, Senior Editor at TES, and it's great to have you with us for this webinar hosted in partnership with the National Institute of Teaching and Education at Coventry University. In this discussion, we're going to be looking at the impact of the government's recent market review of initial teacher training providers and what this means for both the teacher training sector and school recruitment strategies. No doubt many of you will know that the ITT review saw almost 70 providers who were responsible for training almost 4,500 teachers this year fail to gain re-accreditation. Given the government's own data shows that the number of teachers being trained is far below its own targets, the loss of providers seems set to make a bad situation even worse. What's more, the loss of providers will be felt hardest in different regions. For example, around 30% of current trainee teachers in the southwest, northeast, and east of England are providers that did not gain re-accreditation. Even the least affected regions in the east and west Midlands, where initial teaching training providers there who failed to gain re-accreditation were responsible for training almost 400 new teachers. Given many teachers often secure jobs in the area in which they train, it means schools in all regions, but especially those hit hardest, may face even more of a struggle to find and recruit the teachers they need. So clearly a really important issue that the whole sector needs to be aware of, as I'm sure you agree, and that's why you're all here watching this panel. Now, to discuss these concerns and the impact they will have, I'm delighted to welcome a heavyweight panel of experts to share their experiences and expertise and hopefully offer up some solutions for the wider sector on how to address and overcome these issues. They are Professor Geraint Jones, the Executive Director of the National Institute of Teaching and Education, Karen Rose, Director of Partnerships and Organisational Development at EACT, the Multi-Academy Trust, Ian Hunter, the Global Director of our own TES Institute, and Sufian Sadiq, Director of Talent and Teaching School at the Chiltern Learning Trust. So I'm going to go to each panellist now, ask them to sort of introduce themselves in a bit more detail, and again, get their thoughts on where we are at with the ITT market review, this issue of the geographical issues around the lack of re-accreditation for some providers. And then we'll go into our conversation in more detail about how the sector moves forward from here. So, Geraint, Professor Jones, over to you, please.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'm Geraint Jones. I'm from NITE, part of the Coventry University group. And I think having been through re-accreditation and come out the other side, it would be remiss of me not to say what an ordeal that was, and what has happened as a result, has really played a part in perhaps some apathy at present in the sector. But looking forward, what it looks like to me is that there'll be far more partnerships nationally, which are going to get together to provide initial teacher training, especially in areas of the country where there seems to be a lack of providers locally now. And those partnerships will likely add more flexibility into the provision. They'll inevitably involve schools far more in the provision, and especially teaching school hubs. And as I mentioned, I think there'll be more onus on national providers as well to be plugging gaps. There are certainly more national providers now than there were, and some new ones. So I think there'll be a significant onus on them too. I think all of those things aside, though, in terms of what the picture is going to look like, I don't think we will ever really solve the teacher recruitment crisis until we solve the teacher retention issue. At the end of the day, the profile for teaching isn't good. It hasn't been good for some time. Look at any social media channel, and what you'll largely see is negativity towards teaching and teachers leaving for very negative reasons. And that's not going to inspire more and more teachers to join. In fact, it's simply turning them off, as the recent figures are showing. I think until we give more respect to teaching as a sector, until we give teachers time in order to do their jobs effectively, until we give them training, more training at initial and certainly more training to rival law and medicine as continued professional development. And equally, I think we've really got to look at the terms and conditions for teaching. Asking teachers to teach 23 out of 25 hours a week. Are we really surprised with the burnout that's happening? I think we've got to take a good, long, hard look at Ofsted's role and the pressure that's being put on schools, and a serious over-reliance on student performance data and holding schools and heads and teachers to account for that. I really do think we've got to trust our teachers more, and we've got to put more training into them. So They're the views that I'm going to be probably coming from.
Yeah, well, there's loads of big issues there. Obviously, they all sort of interconnect, don't they? With, like you say, the start of a career, the retention of people in a career, how we expect them to work, and obviously the ITT review, like you said, it's been an ordeal for providers and so forth, and created this sense of, for some people, of apathy and whatever you want to term it in the sector. So yeah, really important points. Karen, coming to you next. I mean, obviously you're, like I said at the start, you're in a multi-academy trust, so you're another sort of stage in the sector. Again, what did you have a perspective on the ITT review as it was underway, and since it's occurred? How are you concerned about the lack of providers in some areas? And you're getting, as a national map, have you already starting to sort of can see these geographical issues and they're only going to get worse? What's your take on all that?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so I joined DIAC back in September, and since I've taken over kind of looking at professional development, one of the things we've recognised is that actually for ITT in particular, our schools had really been out on their own. So we hadn't had a national strategy around how we were going to look at ITT. And we are working with a wide range of providers, some of them on a more strategic level, but a lot really kind of on an ad hoc basis by one individual school. And with the market review, one of the things that this has prompted us to think about is how can we be a bit more strategic in how we think about ITT. We're a national map, we cross 10 local authorities. We're in 5 key big cities, and can that help us to think about how we might attract new teachers into the profession by kind of having that offer, and which partners should we be working with? So we're working with both TES and with NITE, as well as a whole range of other people, to just think about how do we cast our net really wide, and how do we make sure that we've got a really strong employee offer that's not just about training teachers and getting them into the profession, but as Geraint says, keeping them with us, thinking about their career progression. And not just through kind of the national programmes, but thinking about really bespoke things that we might be really interested in around things like formative assessment, etc. So we're trying to think of ITT as part of a big piece of the jigsaw, but within ITT also trying to cast that net really wide so that we could attract the absolute best potential candidates. But I think, as everyone says, we do recognise that that pool is getting smaller. The number of partners who we're going to be able to work with is getting smaller, and therefore we'll be in direct competition with other schools and MATs to fight over any potential really high quality candidates.
Yeah, again, some really important points there. And I think, again, I'm no doubt some of the things we're going to go on to talk about are going to cross over these points. And I know there's things that Geraint talked about there about and is working on that will align with some of that. So again, I think we're setting it up nicely here. Ian, again, your perspective on this, again, the market review, where we've been left by the government, and looking to the future a little bit on that, without going into great detail, first answer, but what's your take on all this? And you're on mute. You win the prize for the first person on mute.
Yes, it was always going to happen. Thank you, thank you, Dan, for drawing attention to that. I'm to the global director at TES Institute, so I have a remit for our ITT provisions in the UK, but also internationally. So we see the impact in 2 different settings. I'd echo an awful lot of what Geraint and Karen have said so far. I think having come through reaccreditation probably last May, I think it was, and being working on what that looks like going forward, it's a very confused picture still. I think there's an awful lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the market. I think, as Geraint said, focusing on retention is important. Incredibly important, and the development of teachers within their roles. I think there's a challenge further down the line also in terms of leadership and the capacity available in the market there. I think we've got to focus on partnership, as has been previously said. I think that will work in many different ways. I think it's seen as a little bit of an easy answer. We'll solve it through partnership, and I think there's no one size fits all solution to that. So we're looking at talking to lots of different types of organisations, from SCITs to HEIs, to see how we cover those cold spots. I think what I'm concerned about is we lose those local networks and that expertise in region by being entirely national. And I think there's a hybrid version that retains that knowledge and network in the sector, but provides a national service. So I think there's lots of elements to that we'll talk about over the next 50 minutes or so. I'm looking forward positively, but I think, as I said, I think there's still an amount of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the sector. And actually, to Geraint's earlier point, I think how we get people into teaching needs to be more closely looked at. I don't think it's a particularly efficient way of getting people into the sector, but we can come back to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, great. So make some points there, and again, sort of nice alignment of views and other points to raise. And Sufian, obviously difficult to go last on a question like this, but again, what's your take on this? You know, you are in that sort of more local situation at Chiltern, and you're a teaching school hub as well, which has been mentioned. Again, the market review for you, where have we been left? What are some of the concerns you've got from that, and all the sort of ways forward from what we've been left with?
It's great going last. You can always nick little points from everybody else and make yourself sound amazing.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
I think we're a teaching school hub. We have 2 teaching school hubs covering an area that goes over multiple local authorities, 3 counties, and 650 to 700 odd schools in that area. So I think there is, when I look at ourselves, I see the fact that actually there's a place for us to ensure that there's consistency in both things like the early careers framework, things like the MPQs, and then taking it back on that golden thread to ITT to look at consistency and quality across a region. Now, we have 4 skits within our teaching school hub. By virtue of essentially them joining us, they no longer remain as independent skits. But for us, actually, it's been really important that they don't adopt our names, that they don't adopt our team even, because it's a bit like taking on a school that you can have a different approach. You can plaster your logo all over that school, or you could appreciate the fact that actually that school has a place in that community. And that kind of really, for me, our real mission through this reaccreditation process has been the preservation of wisdom in the system. The system, if you're looking at the way that we've got rid of kind of teaching school alliances, and there were 750 of them, and there were people with extensive knowledge of school-to-school support, teacher development, by virtue of either not having the right P8 or EBAC score, some of them just did not qualify. And that doesn't mean that they weren't effective as teacher development folk. They weren't measured on teacher development and the things that they were really good at. So we've lost that wisdom in the system of experts in that area. We also are losing, and the risk of the loss of experts. There's people in my area, and I'm happy to say I'm the new kid on the block. I might have all of these crazy ideas about how I want things done, but there's people down the road with 25 years plus experience of running skits, of running ITT, running teacher development, people with doctorates in teacher education. The danger is these oracle figures in these communities that are so integral to teacher development in a geographic location are being lost because of the way we've gone about this process. And I kind of want to touch upon that point about, I do think there's a place for being more efficient and improving quality and standards across the board. But I also think that there's a place for having boutique stores and chain stores in a mixed economy. And the danger is that when you make wholesale change like this, you're sometimes only left with chain stores. And there are small boutique provisions, but the way we see boutique provisions, they end up in the really rich and affluent areas where people can afford to have that kind of offer. And the fear is, if you're a rich school with lots to offer, you can go and get teacher development from a nice boutique provider. But areas of high levels of poverty, they're only dealing with that kind of chain providers. And the mixed economy model is one that we really need to look at. Yeah. Teacher diversity and the lack of diversity we've seen through NFER that exists within our workforce is a massive problem. But that wasn't something that was looked at as a criteria when we're looking at reaccreditation. If we know that we've got a sector that doesn't represent our student body, our general population, we've got to do something about it. But that's not being a key factor. That's not even a KPI for us as we move forward. And really, I think the biggest issue that we're facing generally within the system is that there is a recruitment and there's a retention issue at the training level, but there's also a disproportion that if you are now a school that's a standalone school that doesn't work with perhaps large multi-academy trusts, your marketing ability is not at the same level to attract the talent that does come in. And I kind of really go on about this rich school, poor school thing, that those schools that have the systems and infrastructures for great recruitment teams and great marketing teams, the limited supply that is coming into the system will go to a select few, and that geographic spread won't exist, but nor will the spread exist between quality of providers in terms of the higher quality and the richer schools and the richer mats will get them and the others may not.
Yeah, and that's also something you've written about on TES recently. Actually, it's a very interesting point, and one that there's an article on that you can read as well. Now, before we move on to the conversation, I should also say that if you're watching on YouTube, which I'm assuming everyone is, you can ask questions in the chat. So please put them in. We'll keep an eye on that and answer as many as we can. So please do get involved. If something points someone raises, if you want to raise something that hasn't been raised, put it in. We'll try and get them answered. So many things there that have come up, really fascinating area. You can see how much you pull the thread and off we go. Geraint, I'm going to come back to you, and I want to start, if I can recall correctly, the issue of the geographic cold spots and so forth, because we know what you do is the whole point is it's remote, it's flexible. You wrote literally on TES this week about the importance of flexibility. Is there a silver lining maybe from the review that it's going to force people to start being more forward-looking in that regard, that it means we can start thinking about the fact that we can't expect teachers to move up sticks and move, or trainee teachers to move across the country to train, that we've got to think of ways to get them in other ways, and that could be a way of addressing these cold spots, whether that's partnership or whether that's people like yourselves and other trainers thinking, hang on, we've got to have a more spread of options in how we deliver this.
Yeah, I think we've been in existence now. We're in our third year, and we are currently training upwards of 700 trainees, and that's via a national model, as you say, with flexibility, part-time routes. So we're doing something right. We're attracting more people into the profession who perhaps wouldn't have before. So there's inevitability around looking at provision and trying to create accessibility, more accessibility, and especially in the cold spots. But I think that the point made earlier about expertise and the potential of losing expertise is an apt one, and certainly the stories of the partners we are partnering with, and looking to partner with. I think we've got roughly 10 currently coming to us, and there'll be more as school direct partnerships will need to try and partner with new providers. What we're finding there is that the more we can guarantee employment of expertise, then the more hope there is within these particular localities. And that's certainly how we're approaching it. The first and foremost, people are really worried that they're going to lose their jobs. And as such, we are then going to lose the expertise. And so providers like NITE and other providers really should be looking in the first instance to guarantee that employment in some way, and look how contractually that can work, look how that can work through partnership agreements. It's difficult when essentially the curriculum is quite prescribed now, and partners are likely going to adopt the central body's curriculum, but we're finding a lot of success in working through those conversations, early rather than later. And once the worry about employment is out of the way, we can move forward in these localities where there's a lot of concern about whether they're going to be able to recruit teachers.
Yeah, the point about expertise is a key one, isn't it? Because, like you say, through that process of both the move from teaching schools to teaching school hubs, and indeed the ITT process, to lose that is concerning. I mean, to your point there, do you feel that if you are having those conversations, that that is that there's no lack of desire to want to continue in these kind of jobs? It hasn't put them off, but they just want that reassurance. They just want to know, right now we can go back to what we're doing. Okay, it's a different model, it's a different setup, but the people that are committed to it still want to do it.
Yeah, when you look at some of the reasons why providers who haven't been accredited lost the license for 2024, you're looking at one mark which they lost out on in the process, perhaps in an area of mentoring. So, they will have passed on the curriculum, they'll have passed on other aspects, but maybe this one mark off. And I think to just wipe those people out, I just think is really, really naive, actually. So yeah, I think we've got to respect the fact there's a huge amount of expertise out there. There's potential for us to use it. I think we've got to do something about it. In fact, I think the sector's got to do something about that.
Can you say, I mean, you sort of touched this a little bit, but just as a final quick point in that, can you sort of say again, like from your perspective, when that review came to a close, how quickly did you sort of move to think we can do something here? We've got to keep these people. We've got to at least reach out to them, say, look, if there's an opportunity to do this, has that happened?
Yeah, I think we've got to strike a balance between, a notion of, well, we've been successful, so we're coming in to take over, versus the way, and I've heard some horror stories about some new providers taking that approach, versus a more humane approach to say, well, actually what matters to us most is that expertise is kept. So let's work on that first. How can we put a model together whereby you are continuing to contribute, and so that we don't lose that local knowledge? But yes, certainly when we were accredited, we were approached, and we put some communication out there, simply with that message as the underlying factor. We're coming at it from a point of view of, let's keep as many people in the game here as possible.
Yeah, and Ian, it seems right to just sort of quickly go to you for that one again, on that idea of sort of partnerships and retaining that knowledge. I mean, again, without answer as candidly or not as you can, but I mean that sort of role of reaching out to people who, like say, maybe fail by one mark and saying, well, look, we can partner, we can help you keep going. Because that be something that you've been doing in TES Institute and or more widely in the sector? Do you think that's important that we do that? Because that's ultimately, if we don't do that, those people really will be gone forever, and that's no good for anyone, really.
Absolutely, and I think I agree almost entirely with everything Geraint said. It's been our approach. We didn't go out straight away because there was almost a grieving curve that was taking place for a while, and it was the wrong time to approach people. There was also the appeals process that needed to unwind. So we've taken that sensitive approach to work with people. They are scared of losing their jobs, and so that's absolutely the approach we've taken. I also don't think this has been bottomed out yet. I think there's still some road to run. I think there are a number of providers who've been reaccredited, but may not be able to match the criteria required come September 24. So I think there's still some movement to be had in the sector, and things like Ofsted to unfold over the coming year. So I think for me, it's been very much about reaching out to chat, to talk to people, to find out where they are, to not be predatory. I think there's an element of predatory behaviour that's been around for the past few months, and we found that that's been a well-received approach, that people don't want you kind of being predatory over their business. They want to stay in. And to your question earlier, we found in all cases people love what they do, and they're not leaving out of choice. And so we're helping them work with that. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah. And Sufian, I mean, Karen, we'll come to you from that sort of, for the MAP perspective last. I think it makes sense to do on this area. Sufian, for you, again, you're in a slightly different position. You're a teaching school hub. Are you teaching ITT? And again, have you made moves? You raised this point about the expertise. How have you sort of moved to proactively stop that happening, if indeed you have yet, or are looking to do?
We've had 2 ITT skip provisions join us as of September the 1st. So we were quite early on, one of the very first to kind of start that move of getting other local partners. And our mission was to protect provision and to protect staffing, and to ensure that the coverage, and although Bedfordshire is a relatively small county, but the way ITT works is you can be in Luton and you train in Chiltern Training Group, where we are. You can be 12 miles up the road and you wouldn't dream of training in Luton, because it's so different and it's such a different community, that you've always would train in Bedfordshire Schools Training Partnership, and that's where you would train. So 2 of them are over the line. and they're now a part of our organisation, but they maintain, and we've maintained the individual identities, the office, the delivery from the sites, the partnerships, the coordinators, mentors, that's all been absolutely intact. Our fourth one, as a part of the whole, our skit, the two new ones, and then the fourth one's coming over next September, but very much part of our team already with SLA as a partnership agreement. So that's working really well. Lots of work, and it's not difficult. It's very much similar to taking on a school in a multi-academy trust. There's lots of alignment. There's lots of work to be done around culture. So we have this balance of autonomy and alignment, that we want high levels of autonomy to remain, but we want to align on core principles and values. So there's lots of cultural work that we've had to do with those skits. And we've had to try and reassure people, because it's an incredibly unsettling time, because we are from a multi-academy trust background as well. And it does, for many of those people who missed out, like Geraint said about with 1 mark, it feels like the days are numbered and your time's over, and that's a real shame. And while we're talking about 1 mark, is when we're talking about that process, we missed out on the first round by 1 mark. If I was to quantify the cost and investment of what I put in to get that 1 mark off the line, it would be no exaggerations to say tens of £1,000s were spent on just getting 1 extra mark in the mentoring section. Is that the way the system, is that the best use of the fact that we've proven that we're one of the first skits in the country in Chiltern Training Group? We've got a long history of producing brilliant teachers, and for 1 mark, everyone's been taken off everything, and all hands on desks on deck, and we're using expertise from all over the country. 1 mark.
Yeah, that does really highlight some of the concerns there, doesn't it? And I can see there are some questions coming in as well on YouTube, and just to say I've acknowledged them, and we'll try and get through them shortly. Karen, obviously you sit again another sort of stage on. I mean, obviously Sufian sort of straddles both sides, but you're very much, on that, in that multi-academy trust. You're the ones hiring teachers and putting in the classrooms. I suppose it must be pleasing to hear that providers are reaching out and making sure that we don't lose these other providers in the sector. But again, do you sort of hear that, hear stories there like Sufian's and think, yeah, it's really concerning that we're already struggling to find teachers, and we've just now gone through this process with the people who train them up for us that are like this? I mean, again, how have you started seeing that on the front line, and other things again your trust is doing to sort of help at all or fill the gaps, or reaching out to skits and say that we can offer placements for trainees and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It is really concerning. And so one of the things we've just started to do this last term is do a proper audit of all of our schools and what ITT and PGC kind of placements they're offering, so that we can have a better understanding from a central perspective. And that's been really interesting. We've actually got a lot of people going through the assessment only route actually in EAC. So we've got a lot of what I hope is a kind of indication of a really strong pipeline from TAs up through into teaching. But we can definitely see some gaps, particularly around some of those key subjects. And so what we want to look at is how we can strengthen those partnership arrangements. And something that is being trialled in Bristol this year with our 6 primary schools there is a kind of a partnership arrangement between 2 of the universities and the Teaching School Alliance, Teaching School Hub, to think about how they work together on a programme with us, and alongside all of the training that they're providing, we're also kind of wrapping into that some of the kind of EAC specific pieces that we would want to make sure is like really embedded into that programme. It's really early days. We'll wait to see how that kind of model develops for us and whether that's something we want to take forward. And what I'm hoping is that will kind of help us to think both at a national level and national partners and some of that digital kind of way of working, but also thinking about that local knowledge, local insight, local providers, and how we might be able to strike that balance between the two. Yeah, I think that's probably it's still really an emerging picture. We're just waiting to see kind of exactly where everything lands to some extent.
Yeah. And do you know, like, again, I do some research for this piece, and I read a thing, and it may be anecdotal, but it sort of said most teachers get a job within 15 miles of where they train, because that's sort of what you would do, right? You the school down the road type situation. Do you know if that is sort of true again across your map, and therefore, do you have that concern particularly? Like, did you look at the review and think, hang on a minute, there are providers all gone from that region, not all gone, but that's the largest chunk gone. Hang on, that's really going to hit those schools, because suddenly there's going to be several thousand fewer teachers in that region. Is that fair to say that it is very much a local hiring model, and that could be impacted in regions harder than others?
I think predominantly, yes, and certainly for young and new teachers, when you think about cost of living crisis, one of the challenges we know that we have been thinking about is, if we were to try and take people and kind of recruit them and port them into a new place, what kind of wraparound support might we need to provide as an employer that would allow that to happen? So we've been thinking creatively about kind of housing options and like whether we can play a role in that. We think a lot about the staff benefits and employee package that comes with it. But certainly anecdotally, and a lot of the evidence seems to show that people train to teach locally and then go on to teach close to where they've trained.
Yeah, which I suppose does show, doesn't it, why you do need those provided in as many regions as possible, or maybe like what Geraint was talking about, is that sort of flexible, you can do it remotely option because you can stay where you live. And we've written about that on TES before as a sort of long form feature about the benefits of that. And then final question for you, Karen, on that little subject area, or that area, is you mentioned about certain subjects. And again, one thing I looked into is that particularly for STEM, we already know there's a real problem with STEM, and the training providers involved, I think it's like 600 were producing, like mostly physics teachers that are going to now could be gone. Again, is that a concern that particular subjects, if we lose those trainees, if we were to lose those trainees, it wouldn't be just like a problem, it would be a massive one?
I think it would be it's a massive problem, and those are the subjects that we already know are incredibly hard to recruit to. And if you look at any of the data that kind of shows over the last few years, STEM subjects in particular are ones where they've under recruited to year on year before we even get into then a smaller number of providers in the market. I think the only thing I would add, which perhaps thinking about it from a potential person who might be applying to become a teacher, is the system is still so confusing for someone who's thinking about getting into teaching. And I've spoken to other colleagues who work outside kind of the immediate sector, and they've said to me, like, I don't even understand it. You've got this, you've got that. Like, what funding can you get? Which bursary can you get? Is it all paid for? And I think that's one of the things we probably really need to work hard on when we're looking to engage potential graduates to come and do teaching, to make it really, really clear. I think if you just looked on the websites nowadays, it's still incredibly difficult for someone, particularly if you don't come from a teaching family. We know that lots of people who go into teaching have teaching parents or teaching aunts and uncles. If you're not from that background, it is really unnavigatable for them. And I think that's something we need to really look at as well.
Yeah, and it was interesting when you were saying that there were people nodding along on this call who, they're sort of, this is their domain, and yet they're kind of agreeing. And again, someone who's been writing about this on and off for 2 and a bit years, I still struggle to remember what's that again? Which route is that? How does that work? Again, good questions coming in on the YouTube. I will get to them shortly. Just to sort of round that bit off there, just to change the order up. Sufian, again, that point about like certain subject specialisms being hit hardest and the concerns there. Again, is that something you've seen in your teaching school hub, in your trust? Is it when you're part of these skits, you're like, they're really hot on certain subjects, we need to make sure we don't lose that expertise there?
Yes, STEM naturally is an area where at the moment the problem is there's not enough STEM in our region, and that doesn't fit in with the investment in our region. And we're very, very fortunate being in the southeast and the east of England. We get a lot of investment of industry, so there's lots of STEM industries growing in and around Luton and the area. But without STEM teachers, we're not producing the workforce for the future. So in a place like Luton, where you have a Luton 2040 vision of what the STEM world will look like around the airport and the huge investment going in there, but we can't get STEM teachers in our schools to teach physics, to teach maths. And therefore, when they do come into the area, you end up in price wars where people are being paid way above what they should be paid for the level they are at in their career, for their skill and competence, because of the supply and demand and the economics of that takes place, and people end up paying a lot more. And therefore, again, the poorer schools tend to struggle in affording them. You also mentioned a point, and I want to touch on that. We recruit a lot locally in terms of teachers, and our map data shows that our teachers who come into our Luton schools, the vast majority are less than 5 miles away from our schools. And a lot of them have trained within 5 miles of the school that they are now working at. Again, there must be places like this around the country where if they've lost that training provision, what's the knock-on impact of teacher recruitment for the schools in that area, which will be incredibly problematic and challenging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good point, and like I said, worrying one, because for all the work that people are here talking about partnerships and reaching out and keeping the skits, it almost seems invariable that some will be lost and slip through, and then like I say, that regional impact will be huge. Ian, again, sort of come to you, and then we'll just to flip the order up a little bit. From that sort of point on the subject specialisms, again, are you seeing that issue? Are you seeing like decline in certain areas in either yourself and the work you're doing, or providers whereby, you know, we're taking people out of the market where we really have a shortage of these teachers, and what can we do to stop that and then grow it back up again?
Yes, I think inevitably, I think the problem, as has been alluded to, is that the 605 STEM number isn't the problem. It's the fact that that's too small a number, and that we need to get significantly more in. I think of the placements for those types of subjects, I think where the potential partners we're talking to will end up staying in the market. Some of that's HEIs. They will find partnerships that enable them still to deliver. So I think we will be able to protect some of those specialist subjects for sure. We are seeing a little bit of an uptick in the last 3 months in terms of teachers coming into some of these subject areas. That might be just a blip. But certainly, I think the coverage, the national coverage is going to be an issue. I think we will undoubtedly lose those, to Sufian's point. If they're 5 miles away from a school and all of a sudden they're just doing a national provision without any local coverage, then it's going to be a problem.
Yeah. Geraint, I'll come to you on these points if you want to add something, and then I've got some further questions for you. So I don't know if you want to add anything on that subject knowledge issue, particularly. Again, I know you're a language teacher by training, which I know is a subject that has struggled, or often can struggle for numbers. And again, it seems like this is only going to make it worse, which again must sort of add to all the points you raised at the start about it's a problem, right? Big sector-wide issue, not just sort of ITT, but teaching itself.
Yeah, and not a huge amount to add, other than at NITE we seem to be bucking the trend really with STEM trainees. So, you know, maths, chemistry, physics are amongst our higher number cohorts. Having said that, our tuition fee student numbers have decreased, whilst our employed and apprenticeships have increased. And I think what we're finding there is that where head teachers and where schools are taking far more ownership of their recruitment earlier on, i.e. heads are actively looking for graduates themselves to come in so that the school grows their own, if you like, gets the graduate used to their school and then puts them on an apprenticeship program. That is working very, very well. And I think if I was a head again, or the chief of a schools group again, I'd probably be spending 95% of my time on growing my own talent and not necessarily relying on the sector to provide me with, you know, new teachers. And I think, you know, I really can't see ITT numbers going up that much over the next few years. I just don't see it happening. And what will happen there, to Sufian's point about rich and poor schools, I'd take it possibly one step further. And I think it'll be a little bit more of a dogfight between schools who prioritize leadership's time on growing their own and putting in huge professional development programs, as they should, so that the retention decreases and they don't need to recruit as much, versus schools who perhaps don't have the capacity to do that, or indeed perhaps don't have the expertise to do that. So yeah, I'm looking more and more, I think, at options within schools for employed routes. That seems to be where we're certainly growing anyway in the main.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I mean, again, you don't necessarily expect to hear phrases like dogfights and so forth, do you, around teacher training, but it shows where we've got to the people using phrases like that and to describe it. And there's a question that came in that I think kind of you touched on this earlier about flexibility, and I know you've written for TES about the need for 2-year training courses to actually recognise the professionalism of what's required to be a teacher. And there's a question coming, or sort of a comment from someone called Anna Cuccia, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which says we need more flexible routes that allow people to train over 4 years working part-time. Now, obviously 4 years, I guess, that's a certain number. But again, I know your courses are flexible like that. And also you talked about 2-year training routes. I mean, again, that's a huge thing for that to actually happen on a policy level, to change like that. But, you know, for someone in your position to be saying it, people obviously they're watching this saying it, so others would think, but, you know, do you think we're going to have to do something like that if we are going to turn it around from where the current situation we're in?
Yeah, I think Anna's making a seriously valid point there. She should write to us, come and work with us, because we're aligned in our thinking.
Yeah.
The reality for me comes with two strands. One, we've got an immediate issue. So you can't just throw in, let's say, what I keep harping on about, you know, a 2-year ITT model to raise the standards, because I keep saying 36 weeks is nowhere near enough time to effectively train a teacher. It really isn't. But if you put in a 2-year model straight away, that the sector's not ready for that. You know, the sector allows for 36 weeks, and so that's what people will buy. But there has to be a long-term plan. There has to be a 10 to 20-year strategy whereby we're raising the profile of teaching so that the job is an aspirational job. It's a highly professional job. It respects expertise. And what we'll find then is dropout rates will be fewer. That is simply what will happen, but that won't happen overnight. And I just can't see any longer term strategies in place. What we seem to have is 4-year strategies according to political cycles. It's a voting tool. We've got to take it beyond politics, almost out of politics, and say, look, 20 years ago, when I started teaching, there was a recruitment crisis. 20 years on, we've still got one. And we've still got one because all that seems to come out are these short-term incentives. Plug the gap, throw money at it, it'll be okay. Just kicks the can down the road. So whilst, you know, yes, we've got to have these incentives. Yes, we need more partnerships and more flexibility, part-time routes, absolutely. Come to us, we will do that. We've got to start thinking longer term. 20 years, in 20 years' time, don't want to be where we are now. And that should look like initial teacher training, respected, 2 years. Continued professional development throughout your career, and actually pay linked to that. Every teacher, for me, should have a master's degree. That's respecting and dignifying the profession. And what you create then is aspiration. Yes, you've got to match it with terms and conditions. You've got to have the pay right. You've got to have teachers really at maximum 70% timetable. 19 hours a week is enough. They have to do all the other jobs around that. So it's two-pronged, right? It's the longer term and it's looking at more flexibility short term to enable more people to come in.
Yeah, there's another comment that's coming from someone called Fiona Hepton who says for them it's not a problem of falling application numbers. So I'm assuming she's within ITT, but they're finding the applications we receive are not of a quality we would expect or desire, which I think in some ways comes to your point there exactly, which is, but if you had then more time with those people potentially, and you could actually make sure that the people applying knew what they were getting into, because this is a 2-year thing, it's high quality, you know, you really know for so pushed and so forth. Do you think that sort of, you know, without repeating the point, do you think that sort of covers that a little bit as well?
It's an interesting one, that, you know, because what do I look for? What do we look for at NITE for in a trainee teacher? Well, the majority haven't had any experience. So you can't really expect them to know lots. And so you can't really judge them on how good they're going to be. What we tend to look for is attitude, you know, passion, subject knowledge from their degree, empathy with young people, knowledge of perhaps, you know, educational psychology. They've done a little bit of background reading on it. It's our job then to train them. So you know, I don't necessarily agree with, you know, we're getting lots of people applying, but they're not good enough. It's our job to make them good. And let's look at characteristics which make good teachers in the first instance. I think I'm not beating up on ITT providers here, by the way. I think ITT providers are under huge amounts of pressure to minimize their risks when it comes to the students they take, because if you have higher dropout rates or if you have higher failure rates in ITT, you get hammered by Ofsted. And so you take lower risks on entry and inevitably probably turn people away who might just be good, but you don't want to take that risk because it'll come back on you in the end. So, you know, for me, it's a tricky situation, but just highlighting really our attitude towards it.
It makes a lot of sense. And Karen, again, from your perspective, again, we're talking about ITT here, we're talking about the models and the concerns, but, you know, like this idea of a longer training period, you know, do you see that? Do you work with teachers who, again, like Geraint said, when you describe it, it's 36 weeks to go from starting your training to being in a classroom in front of, you know, children of any age, it sounds quite daunting. Like someone like me, I think, God, that does sound short, you know. Do you see that with some of your teachers and you sort of think, actually, yeah, you know, more time training, really pushing them, giving them that time to learn, to grow, making them, you know, do more sort of preparation? That's a good thing. And how we get to that, let's sort of worry about that down the line. But, you know, let's not debate that here and now. But do you think, can you see logic in that as an idea?
I can, absolutely. And I think that is what ECT was designed to do. But at the moment, my view is that ITT and ECT doesn't connect up enough. And then what we do have sometimes is where we've had people who've been maybe teaching assistants, learning mentors, and then qualified, they're then finding the ECT programme very restrictive. So it's just not all quite connected up in the right way to give you that kind of that flow of kind of professional development, whether that's 2 years of ITT or whether that's ECT. Some of it's moving the blocks around, but for me it's about that kind of flow and then making sure it's really tailored to the individuals, so that where we've got really experienced people who've been working in school maybe for 4 or 5 years and have then qualified, that they are then not kind of forced through the same route as someone who's, like you say, spent 36 weeks training and that's all they've ever done. And there's not that flexibility in the moment in the ECT model, I don't think, that allows us to kind of proportionalise that. The other thing I wanted to pick up on is I think the flexible model would be really, really beneficial. We've got a lot of staff, I think, who would benefit from that. You know, people that, when we talk about growing your own and being able to work alongside, kind of continue to work alongside doing the training, I think that would be really, really valuable. And I'm really passionate particularly about how we then make sure that is also available when you qualify as a teacher, and how we can ensure that there is some flexible working in the teaching model so that we can retain both new staff and particularly millennials and beyond who are used to, you know, have been brought up in a completely different generation of what work looks like. Also thinking particularly about women who might go and have children, and we know that there's still a gender imbalance in childcare. We know it's still a massive challenge for women in the workforce. There's loads of great groups working on this already around like flex in the middle and all sorts. But I think actually if we're going to model that through ITT, it then also needs to be available kind of forward into your ongoing career so that we can retain those great people, teachers going forward.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the DFE, I know, very recently put out a flexible working piece of research and so forth. And even before that came out, but at TES, we're doing something, talking to schools that are doing innovative flexible working things, and that piece will be out soon. So again, you're absolutely right. Just to start with a flexible course and then take it away the moment you qualify does seem perverse. And Ian, again, just to bring you back in on this again, some of these points raised here again, do you see this? Do you sort of ever sort of hit again within your role, or when you're talking to the wider market about, you know, people realizing that we need to be more flexible, we need to have different routes, we need longer time to train them because it's just not long enough. You know, like there's a lot of points that have come up there, but again, just to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. I think something Karen said about it not being connected up. I think, you know, we are trying to extend some of those pathways. Geraint has talked about apprenticeships, and we've started to look at level 3 teaching assistant or delivering level 3 teaching assistant apprenticeships, because we're trying to lengthen that journey for that learner. And the pathways in are incredibly complex. You know, it's hard enough if you're based in the UK and you want to teach in the UK. If you're based overseas and you want to teach in the UK, it's incredibly difficult to work out what that pathway through is. And so making it simpler to do, I think, is important. And I think with that journey through a level 3, a level 6, or whatever the various routes are, that gives you that longer period of learning and more depth to that learning before you fully qualify. So I think simplifying some of those journeys, I think getting people into the profession in the right way. We do, the DFE run something called Get Into Teaching events. And very often people will come to those events, but they come expecting to be able to get into teaching, but they don't have a role in a school. And so there's a disconnect there. You have lots and lots of people who are interested, but they turn up at an event that doesn't facilitate that because they haven't got a school that they work with. Yet there are schools over here with vacancies galore. So I think a lot of it is about matching up the learner with the opportunity and extending that period of initial teacher training.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that people want to be teachers and can't really work their way out to get into the sector. We had a piece on TES not that long ago from someone called Loic Menzies talking about how we need to how make it easier to fall into the profession. You know, there's people who never meant to be teachers, but just somehow happened one day. They went into a classroom once and they loved it or something like that. And he did some research on that about a lot of teachers. That was how they spent 20 years in the profession. So clearly that needs to happen. And we've got 10 minutes left of the discussion. You know, more questions. I'm going to get to a couple more. So if you want to throw some in there, please do. Sufian, you seem to be back. I'm going to, on this point here about flexibility, longer courses, again, conscious of the time, but again, just to bring you in to have a say on that if you'd like to, around, you know, do you agree with that? Do we need to do more to make make ITT better? It would entice more people, it would make them stay in the profession longer as well.
Yes, I think what we have on offer at the moment, we know isn't quite cutting it. And I think therefore creativity around trying new things, trying things that we've never tried before. I think some of the larger organizations that have the flexibility or perhaps are able, if the government's able to commission them to trial different approaches, different systems, because I think that creativity around how we approach teacher development as a whole, not just in the ITT stage, I think teacher development as a whole, we need to look at the creativity of what we do, how we do it. Where for example, and I'm looking into the work we do around maternity and paternity and while parents are off, and what teacher development and training can look like for kit days and how it can be more family inclusive, but also again, how teacher development doesn't necessarily mean that it's a massive sacrifice of parent time, of family time, because when people talk about teacher training, the words that are synonymous with it are not words that are very attractive to people for it to enter into the profession or to even last in the profession. It's often, it's workload, it's cumbersome, it's going to take a toll on their personal lives. And we know that actually work-life balance is really important to people. And so is the fact that actually being out of action for considerable periods of time when you're not earning, when in the middle of an energy and cost of living crisis, is no longer a luxury that many people can afford. So that luxury almost lends itself very well to a 21-year-old straight out of uni, still in mum and dad's bedroom at home. But when you're living away and you've got your own bills and overheads, it suddenly becomes really difficult. So yeah, remodeling the system is definitely something we need to be flexible and creative about.
Yeah, and Geraint, I mean, this obviously there's a question that someone else put in, as an M Trade. I think that's, again, hope I pronounced that right. Who says, how is digitization and digital fluency improving ITT? Will this be more attractive, necessary to the digital native trainee? Now, obviously, you do this kind of remote teaching, which requires being online. I think actually you're going to say that a lot of people are not digital natives. They're all age spans, right? But again, everyone's sort of talking about this need to reform. Do you think that's fair, that if people are more digitally native, that a remote course, a flexible course, is going to be more appealing, or is it something that needs to be out there as a sort of standard offer, not just like a sort of one-off here and there that people like yourselves that do it?
Yeah. What our trainees tell us is that the fact that they can access all of their learning, all of their materials, all of their resources 24/7 online, the fact that they can revise them, go back into them, check, double check, lectures, webinars, tutorials are all recorded, and they can go back to them. And they can go back to them whenever they want to, and they can study on the train home or on the bus, on their tablet, on their mobile. It gives them more time just during their lives. So that sits as the backbone of our offer. But what makes it work is the humane element of tutors. There has to be a transfer from the somewhat faceless, let's just call it, online world into the relationship, the humane relationship between me as a trainee and my university personal tutor, and then the school-based mentor. And I think if you do that, online is probably going to be the future because of its accessibility, because of how flexible you can make study. But ignore the humane element at your peril. And again, you know, the feedback from our trainees is that you can acquire all the knowledge in the world, you know, you want to, but your PGC or your teacher training is only really great if the mentor or the tutor you're working with is great. Simple. That sounds really, really simple, right? But there is a huge onus there on training for mentors, capacity for mentors in school. Take the ECT, for example. You can argue it's kind of been dumped on schools, right? But without the money, without the support, without the resource to genuinely do it effectively. I think the idea is a really good one and it's going in the right direction. But if we're going to do it, provide the resource for schools to be able to do it properly. Or bring ITT providers into it so that they're holding hands, so that there is this continuity, there is this ownership. But certainly, you know, online combined with brilliant mentoring, combined with brilliant training of mentors is the way forward. Yeah.
I mean, this Anna person in the comments, I think she'll come and work for you because again, she's fully agreeing on the grow your own route, and she mentions about diversity. And again, someone called Nancy Ellis talks about diversity as well, and you know, how we get more people in who maybe never thought about teaching. Not really have time to talk about that, but again, a really interesting point. Shows there could be a whole other webinar in that alone, probably on diversity and inclusion and so forth. It's really important. So we've got 5 minutes left. What I'm going to do is that really annoying thing as host. I'm going to come to each of you and give you like 1 minute to sum up or put a final point across, or what do you want people to take away from this? What are you going to promise to do to sort of help tackle all these various things we talked about? Ian, I'm going to come to you first. Work my way around my screen. So again, try and really, and that 1 minute thing, I'm really going to try and make you stick to that.
Wow. Okay, so what I'd like people to take away from this is that there is a significant issue, but there are ways that we can work together to solve it. I think there are partnerships that can be had between the likes of the people on this call. We work with NITE, we work with EACT. I think there's no one model for this. People shouldn't and needn't be cut adrift. I think there's a lot of reasons to be positive for people to retain their roles, retain their identity, but it's about exploring those different types of partnership. I think that would be the thing that I would encourage people to do. I think there's still plenty of time to do that properly, to be sure that you're happy with who you're choosing as a partner. And that's what I'd like people to remember.
Great. That's a model answer. I think that was bang on. Karen, you're next.
Okay, 2 points from me, but I'll make sure they're really, really quick. I think one is just picking up on something Geraint said earlier about the kind of potential of candidates. And that's something that I think we need to really be thinking about as someone who takes ITT and recruits new teachers, is recruiting on the potential of somebody rather than them being the finished article, because actually that's the whole point of the training program. So looking for that potential and those behaviours and attitudes that would make somebody a great teacher when they're trained. And then the second point was just around the importance of that kind of triangle of the mentor and the trainee and the tutor. And I think that's a really, really important triangle. But one of the other things we're trying to do in EACT is to look at how can we take all of our ITT trainees and build a network across all of our schools, so that actually they're not in a kind of isolated triangle, they're part of a kind of greater movement and they can draw on each other for support. And that's not just about support through ITT, but through the future, and then thinking about how we then might be able to look at their development further on, whether that's staying in one school or moving around as part of the trust.
Yeah, excellent. Again, another fantastic answer. Very well done. Sufian, again, now for you, the challenge.
I think the brilliant points noted by Ian and Karen, and I don't want to repeat them. For me, it's really about we need to, as providers, as people responsible for training, we need to go out and see the diverse talent that exists. The lack of ethnic minorities feeling uncomfortable to come into teaching, or not being, exactly like Karen said, the finished products, and us turning people away almost disproportionately from training as teachers has to be something that we look at training to teach as an ethnic minority teacher can't be limited to central London and places like Luton and Bradford and Leicester. We've got to do more across the country to make it an inclusive and attractive career for people from ethnic minority backgrounds.
Yeah, really fantastic point, really important. We wrote about that test about a year ago. It'd be fascinating to go back and see if things have progressed anywhere from there and see what the next census data is. And Geraint, finally, we start with you. So we end with you, close the loop. Again, what's your sort of final 1 minute takeaway for everyone?
I'm going to chuck something out there which is semi-new and semi-controversial just to end it all. And we're all in this to raise standards. No one, I don't think anyone comes into teaching not to improve things. And yet we have an inspectorate who sells itself on being a force for improvement. That's just no cultural alignment there between the sector and the inspectorate. That's got to change. And that the only way it changes is if we own improvement. And that means there's two ways of improving and raising standards. One, through curriculum, and two, through training. I think if we put those two things at the heart of the sector, the heart of schooling, we won't need Ofsted. They'll be just not required because we're doing it ourselves. And that comes back to initial teacher training. It comes back to the point I labour over and over. We will never genuinely raise standards if we only have a 36-week postgraduate ITT program. It's just not enough time. Whereas if we raise the bar, increase that amount of training, you'll get better teachers coming in. And those better teachers will raise standards. They will be trusted, at which point you don't need a whip as a force for improvement.
Yeah, well, an excellent final point there, and landed very nicely, I think. So thank you everyone for the overall input into the whole discussion, particularly on your 1 minute answers there. That was incredibly, I think that was one of the best I've ever seen of those. And, for everyone who watched and found that enjoyable or watches on demand, and I'm sure everyone here would say, if you want to get in touch, if you want to reach out to them on social media, LinkedIn, they're more than happy to talk further. I know everyone here is super, open and like sharing. And Sufian's putting his thumbs up, and, you can see they took the time to take part in this and share what they're thinking and they're doing. Really important topic. Thank you everyone for taking part and watching, and hopefully we'll see you again on another TES webinar soon.